The rain came down in torrents as Derek pulled his cab into the waiting line at the corner of 10th Avenue and 34th Street. It had been a slow evening, the city quieter than usual, as if the weather had driven everyone indoors. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:48 p.m. "One more fare, and I'm calling it," Derek muttered to himself. His yellow cab sat idling as he scrolled through the radio channels, searching for something to keep him awake. The last couple of weeks had been odd. Every night, his final passenger would always seem to be a man in a dark coat, face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, requesting a drop-off at a desolate address on the outskirts of the city. The stranger had an unsettling presence, quiet and polite yet exuding an air of unease. Tonight was no different. At precisely 11:59, Derek spotted him under the glow of a flickering streetlight. The man stepped out of the shadows, his shoes splashing through the puddles as he approached the cab. Derek sighed, half hoping this would be the night someone else would take the slot 4 last ride. The man opened the door and slid into the back seat. "Where to?" Derek asked, already anticipating the answer. "End of Evergreen Lane," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Derek hesitated. The address was a dead-end street bordered by overgrown trees and abandoned warehouses. He'd Googled it once out of curiosity but found nothing. "You sure?" "It's pretty far out," Derek ventured, though he already knew the response. "Yes," came the curt reply. Derek adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the man's face, but the hat's brim shadowed his features. He put the cab in gear and pulled onto the slick roads. As they drove, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man never made conversation, didn't fidget with his phone, and always carried the same leather satchel. Tonight, though, the satchel seemed heavier. Derek's curiosity began to gnaw at him. "You headin' to work or something?" Derek asked, his tone light. "Just meeting someone," the man replied, not elaborating. Derek tightened his grip on the wheel. He couldn't say why, but the man's vague answers always left him feeling like he should ask more but never daring to. The streets became darker as they neared Evergreen Lane. Few streetlights worked in this part of the city, and the ones that did cast an eerie yellow glow on the wet asphalt. Derek felt his pulse quicken. When they reached the end of Evergreen Lane, the man leaned forward, his face nearly touching the plexiglass divider. "Wait here," he said. Derek watched as the men disappeared into the shadows. The rain pounded on the cab's roof, and the sound of distant thunder echoed through the air. He considered leaving, driving off without waiting. But the fare was generous, and times were tough. He adjusted his seat and fiddled with the radio again. Time passed. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Finally, he saw the man emerge, walking briskly with the satchel in hand. It was now noticeably lighter. "Let's go," the man ordered as he climbed back into the cab. Derek hesitated. He couldn't help but glance at the satchel, noting that it was slightly ajar. Something metallic gleamed within. "What's in the bag?" Derek asked, unable to keep his curiosity at bay. The man's head turned slowly, his shadowed face fixing on Derek's reflection in the mirror. "Mind your own business," he said. His tone carried a warning, one that made Derek's stomach churn. The ride back to the city was tense. Derek's mind raced with questions, but he forced himself to focus on the road. The man paid in cash, leaving a generous tip as always, and slipped into the night. Derek watched him vanish, then sped off, his hands trembling on the wheel. That night, Derek couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the events over and over. Who was the man? What was he doing at that abandoned address? And what was in the satchel? By morning, Derek's curiosity had won out. He decided to return to Evergreen Lane. In the daylight, the desolate area looked even more sinister. The warehouses were covered in graffiti, their windows boarded up or shattered. Derek parked his cab and ventured toward the end of the lane. He found footprints in the mud leading to a decrepit warehouse. The door creaked open when he pushed it, revealing an interior that reeked of mildew and decay. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a pile of rags in the corner. He stepped closer and froze. The rags were a body, pale and lifeless. Derek stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. His heart pounded as he noticed something glinting beside the body, a small metal object, unmistakably a knife. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him. He spun around, his breath hitching. "Should have stayed in your cab," said a voice, low and threatening. It was the man. Derek's blood ran cold as the man stepped out of the shadows, his wide-brimmed hat in place and a glint in his eyes that spoke of danger. "Now you've seen too much," the man said, his tone chillingly calm. Derek realized too late that his curiosity had led him straight into a nightmare. The cold steel of the knife glinted in the faint light filtering through the warehouse's cracked windows. Derek stood frozen, the man in the wide-brimmed hat blocking the exit. "You really should have minded your own business," the man said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down Derek's spine. Derek's pulse thundered in his ears. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. I didn't mean to," Derek stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head, studying Derek like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, without warning, he lunged. Derek barely managed to dodge the man's outstretched hand. He stumbled backward, tripping over debris scattered across the warehouse floor. The man advanced, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like he knew Derek had nowhere to go. Panic surged through Derek as he scrambled to his feet. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route. In the corner, he spotted a narrow staircase leading to an upper level. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. He climbed the stairs two at a time, the sound of the man's boots close behind him. At the top, he found himself in a small loft filled with old, rusted machinery. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Derek ducked behind a large metal press, his chest heaving as he tried to quiet his breathing. The man's voice echoed from below. "You can't hide, Derek. I know this place better than you do." Derek's stomach dropped. The man knew his name. The sound of boots on metal rang out as the man ascended the staircase. Derek crouched lower, his fingers gripping the edge of the press. He needed a plan, but his mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. His eyes landed on a length of chain hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Quietly, he reached up and grabbed it, wrapping it around his hand for a better grip. The footsteps grew louder. Derek could see the shadow of the man's hat as he neared the top of the stairs. "Come on, Derek," the man taunted. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Derek's breath caught as the man stepped into view. Without thinking, Derek swung the chain with all his might. It struck the man across the chest, knocking him off balance. The man stumbled but didn't fall. Instead, he straightened, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "Good try," he said, lunging forward. Derek dodged, his heart pounding in his chest. He swung the chain again, this time catching the man's arm. The knife clattered to the ground, and Derek seized the opportunity to run. He bolted down the stairs, his legs burning with the effort. The man's enraged shouts followed him, but Derek didn't look back. He burst out of the warehouse and into the daylight, his lungs aching for air. The streets were deserted. Derek sprinted toward his cab, parked a block away. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door and jumped inside. As he started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the street, watching him. Derek floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the warehouse. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? And how did he know Derek's name? That night, Derek couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face and the lifeless body on the warehouse floor. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Around 2 a.m., his phone buzzed with a notification. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message. "You can't outrun the truth, Derek. See you soon." Derek's blood ran cold. He stared at the screen, his hands trembling. How did the man get his number? He tried to call the police, but his phone wouldn't connect. It was as if the man had somehow jammed the signal. Determined to find answers, Derek began searching online for anything that could explain what was happening. He found a news article about a series of murders in the city, all connected by one chilling detail: each victim had been a cab driver. His stomach churned as he read the descriptions of the killer. The wide-brimmed hat. The leather satchel. The knife. It was him. The next day, Derek decided to confront his fears head-on. He returned to the warehouse, determined to find evidence that would incriminate the men and bring him to justice. But when he arrived, the warehouse was empty. The body was gone, and there were no signs of a struggle. As he stood there, trying to piece everything together, he felt a presence behind him. "You just don't learn, do you?" Derek turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The man stood in the shadows, his knife gleaming in the dim light. "You're in this now, Derek," the man said, stepping closer. "And there's no way out." Derek's pulse pounded in his ears as he faced the men. The dim light filtering through the warehouse windows cast long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. "You should have stayed away," the man growled, his voice low and guttural. He took a step forward, his knife glinting ominously. "I'm not afraid of you," Derek lied, his voice shaking. He reached into his pocket and gripped his phone, hoping to record the encounter or call for help. The man chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Derek's spine. "You're already in too deep." Derek feinted to the left and then bolted to the right, hoping to escape through the warehouse door. His breath came in short gasps as he sprinted toward the exit. The man's footsteps echoed behind him, fast and deliberate. Derek didn't dare look back. He reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling out into the open air. The alley was deserted, the faint hum of the city's nightlife just a distant murmur. Derek darted around the corner, searching for a place to hide. He spotted a dumpster and crouched behind it, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His hands trembled as he fumbled to unlock his phone. No signal. A shadow loomed over him. "You're predictable," the man said, his voice cold and mocking. Derek spun around, swinging his phone like a weapon. The man caught his wrist effortlessly and wrenched the device from his hand, tossing it aside. "You really thought you could run?" The man's grin was predatory. "I've been doing this for years, Derek. You're not special." Desperation surged through Derek. He lunged at the men, trying to wrestle the knife from his grip. They grappled, the sound of their struggle echoing through the alley. The knife clattered to the ground, and Derek kicked it away, his adrenaline surging. He landed a punch squarely on the man's jaw, sending him staggering backward. But the victory was short-lived. The man recovered quickly, his movements unnervingly precise. He grabbed Derek by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You're feisty," the man said, his breath hot against Derek's face. "That's good. Makes it more fun." Derek struggled, but the man's grip was ironclad. "What do you want from me?" Derek shouted, his voice echoing in the narrow alley. The man leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You'll find out soon enough." Suddenly, a car horn blared in the distance, breaking the tension. The man released Derek, his head snapping toward the sound. "Looks like you're lucky tonight," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "But this isn't over." Before Derek could react, the man melted into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Derek collapsed against the wall, his legs shaking. He retrieved his phone and checked it again. The signal had returned. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers. 911, what's your emergency?" Derek's voice cracked as he recounted the events. "A man attacked me. He's dangerous. I think he's the one behind the cab driver murders." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "Can you tell me your location?" Derek provided the address, his eyes darting around the alley. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified his paranoia. "Officers are on their way." "Stay where you are," the dispatcher said. Minutes felt like hours as Derek waited. When the police arrived, he explained everything, from the eerie last passenger to the encounter at the warehouse. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "We've been tracking this guy for months," one of them said. "But he's slippery. Never leaves evidence behind." Derek's stomach churned. "What happens now?" The officer's expression was grim. "We'll increase patrols in the area, but you need to be careful. If he's targeting you, he won't stop." That night, Derek couldn't sleep. Every creak of his apartment felt like the man slipping inside. Every shadow seemed to contain his predator's piercing gaze. Unable to bear the suffocating fear, Derek began researching the murders. He pored over news articles, police reports, and crime blogs, piecing together a timeline. The killer always targeted cab drivers, leaving their bodies in deserted areas with no witnesses or clues. But Derek had survived, breaking the pattern. Why? The answer came 2 days later. While reviewing footage from his cab's dashcam, Derek noticed something chilling. The man had been in his car before. Months ago. He had picked him up late one night, dropping him off at an address Derek barely remembered. It wasn't a random encounter. The man had been watching him, planning. A cold realization washed over Derek. The killer wasn't just targeting him. He was toying with him. Determined to take control, Derek returned to the warehouse with a flashlight and a crowbar. If the police couldn't catch the killer, he'd find evidence to expose him. The warehouse was silent, its shadows deeper than before. Derek's footsteps echoed as he navigated the labyrinth of crates and machinery. In the corner, he found a small room with a locked door. He pried it open with the crowbar, revealing a chilling sight. Photographs. Dozens of them, pinned to the walls. Every photo was of Derek, taken from various angles and locations. Some were from months ago, others from just days earlier. In the center of the room was a note, scrawled in red ink. "See you soon." Derek's grip tightened around the crowbar as his eyes darted over the chilling scene before him. The photographs pinned to the walls told a haunting story, one of obsessive surveillance and twisted intent. Each image showed him in mundane moments, pumping gas, walking into his apartment, or driving his cab. How long has he been following me? Derek's mind raced. The air in the small room felt thick, almost suffocating. He grabbed one of the photos, a shiver running down his spine. This one was recent, taken just 2 nights ago as he exited the grocery store. His reflection in the store's glass door betrayed the fear he didn't even know he was carrying then. His attention was drawn to a table in the center of the room. On it lay a collection of items that didn't belong to him, a torn cab receipt, a set of gloves, and a small stack of journals. The journals, bound in black leather, had no titles. Derek hesitated before flipping open the first one. The pages were filled with detailed notes about him. Derek Linden. Age 32. Drives cab number 4729. Route includes Midtown to Queens. His stomach churned as he read further. Observed him leaving work at 10:45 p.m. He takes the same route home every night. The notes grew darker. He's perfect. No family to notice if he disappears. No close friends. A ghost in the crowd. Derek slammed the book shut, his breath coming in short gasps. The killer had been planning this for months. Suddenly, the faint creak of a floorboard echoed from somewhere in the warehouse. Derek froze, his ears straining for any further sounds. Another creak. Closer this time. He's here. Derek extinguished his flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the crowbar, his knuckles white. The door to the small room creaked open, light spilling in from the warehouse. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. "I told you to stay out of this," the man growled. His voice sent chills down Derek's spine. Without thinking, Derek swung the crowbar with all his strength. The figure dodged, and the metal smashed into the doorframe with a deafening clang. The killer lunged at Derek, knocking him back into the table. They grappled, the small room amplifying every sound. Derek managed to elbow the man in the ribs, creating enough space to scramble for the door. He burst into the warehouse, his shoes pounding against the concrete floor as he ran. Behind him, the killer's footsteps were relentless, closing the gap. "You think you can get away from me?" the man taunted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Derek darted between crates, trying to lose his pursuer. His breathing was ragged, his body screaming for rest. But the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him moving. He spotted a stack of metal pipes leaning precariously against a wall. With a desperate burst of energy, he pushed them over, sending them crashing to the floor. The noise was deafening, and for a moment, he thought he'd bought himself some time. But the killer's voice cut through the chaos. "Nice try, Derek. You're making this fun." Derek's mind raced. He needed a weapon, something to level the playing field. His eyes scanned the warehouse, landing on a discarded wrench lying near a workbench. He grabbed it and turned to face his pursuer. The killer emerged from the shadows, a sinister grin on his face. Finally ready to fight, the man sneered, raising his knife. The two clashed in a brutal, desperate fight. Derek swung the wrench, narrowly missing the killer's head. The man retaliated with a slash of his knife, slicing through Derek's jacket and grazing his arm. Pain shot through him, but he refused to back down. "You're not walking away from this," Derek shouted, his voice hoarse. The killer laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Neither are you." Derek saw his chance. He feinted to the left, then lunged to the right, slamming the wrench into the killer's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. Derek didn't hesitate. He kicked the knife away and swung the wrench again, this time connecting with the killer's ribs. The man stumbled, coughing, but he wasn't finished. With a surge of fury, the killer tackled Derek to the ground. They wrestled, each struggling for dominance. Derek's fingers found a shard of broken glass on the floor. He grabbed it and drove it into the killer's shoulder. The man howled in pain, rolling off Derek. Derek scrambled to his feet, clutching his injured arm. He looked down at the killer, who was writhing on the ground, blood seeping from his wound. "You're done," Derek said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. The killer glared up at him, his expression twisted with rage. "You think this is over? You don't know what you've stepped into." Derek didn't wait for an explanation. He turned and ran, exiting the warehouse into the cold night air. As he reached the safety of the street, Derek collapsed against a lamppost, gasping for breath. His body ached, his mind racing with the events of the night. He pulled out his phone and called 911, his fingers shaking. "I found him," Derek said when the operator answered. "The men behind the murders. He's in the warehouse on Willow Street." The operator assured him that officers were on their way, but Derek couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Derek staggered down the street, adrenaline ebbing away and leaving him feeling hollow. His arm throbbed where the knife had grazed him, and the metallic scent of blood clung to him like a second skin. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night air, a reminder that help was on its way, but was it too late? The warehouse loomed behind him, a dark, silent monolith. Derek couldn't shake the image of the killer's twisted grin or his cryptic final words. "You don't know what you've stepped into." As he leaned against the lamppost, Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled it out, his fingers slick with sweat and blood. The screen showed an incoming call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Derek," the voice drawled on the other end. The killer's voice. Derek's breath caught. "How the hell? You didn't think it'd be that easy, did you?" The killer chuckled, his tone infuriatingly calm. "I told you, this isn't over." The line went dead. Panic surged through Derek as he frantically looked around. The street was empty, the only sound the distant echo of his pounding heart. He considered running, but where would he go? The sound of footsteps behind him froze him in place. "Derek," a voice whispered. But it wasn't the killer's voice. It was softer, familiar. He turned slowly, and his heart sank. The woman who had hailed his cab earlier in the week, the one who had begged him to take her to the strange address, stood there. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy, her clothes torn. "You're part of this now," she said, her voice hollow. Before Derek could respond, the air around them seemed to shift. The streetlights flickered, and a chill ran through him. The woman took a step closer, and he saw something in her eyes, fear, but also desperation. "Run," she whispered. Derek didn't need to be told twice. He bolted down the street, his legs screaming in protest. He could hear footsteps behind him, more than one pair, and the sound sent shivers down his spine. He turned a corner, hoping to lose his pursuers, but instead found himself in a dead end. The alley was narrow, flanked by towering brick walls, and a single dumpster sat at the far end. The footsteps stopped. Derek turned to face the entrance of the alley, his chest heaving. Standing there was the killer, flanked by two others, both wearing masks, their faces hidden but their intent clear. "You thought you could stop me," the killer said, his voice dripping with mockery. Derek raised his hands, gripping the wrench he'd held onto. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice wavered. The killer laughed. "You're in my game now, Derek. And no one gets out alive." The masked figures moved toward him, their movements slow but deliberate. Derek's mind raced. He couldn't take them all on, he barely escaped the warehouse alive. His eyes darted to the dumpster. It was a long shot, but it might give him a momentary advantage. As the figures closed in, Derek hurled the wrench at the nearest one, hitting them square in the chest. The figure stumbled, giving Derek just enough time to sprint toward the dumpster. He leaped onto it, scrambling for the top of the wall. His fingers clawed at the rough bricks, his nails breaking as he pulled himself up. The killer's voice echoed below. "Run all you want, Derek. I'll find you." Derek didn't look back. He dropped onto the other side of the wall, landing hard on his side. Pain shot through him, but he forced himself to his feet. He stumbled into the next street, his legs shaking. The sirens were closer now, a beacon of hope in the chaos. A police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of him, and 2 officers jumped out. "Are you Derek Linden?" one of them asked, their hand on their holstered weapon. "Yes," Derek gasped. "The killer, he's back there." "In the alley." The officers exchanged a glance before drawing their weapons. They moved toward the alley cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Derek watched from the safety of the cruiser, his body trembling. Minutes felt like hours as he waited. Finally, the officers returned, their faces pale. "There's no one there," one of them said. Derek's blood ran cold. "What?" "No, they were there. I saw them." The officers shook their head. "We'll check the area, but it looks like they're gone." Derek was taken to the station to give a statement. He recounted everything, the passengers, the strange address, the photos in the warehouse. The officers listened intently, their expressions skeptical. "We'll investigate," one of them assured him. "But you should get some rest." Rest? Derek doubted he'd ever rest again. That night, he lay in his apartment, every sound making him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. A single message lit up the screen. "You'll see me soon." The next morning, Derek's cab was found abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's seat was stained with blood, and the words "Game Over" were scrawled on the windshield in red. Derek was never seen again. The killer's game continues.